Open Market is sponsored by AdLib, the self-serve DSP solution making advertising easy. What do the world's largest demand-side platforms have in common? They're effective, but they require large annual contracts and spend minimums. With AdLib, growing agencies get a single platform that connects to every top global DSP with no contracts, no spend minimums, and G2's #1 ranked support. That means access to the entire universe of TV, digital out-of-home, audio, display, video, and native without a hassle and with no blind spots. It's incredibly easy to use, plus it can automate most of the work your team spends hours a day doing manually. Get the most powerful media buying technology without the barriers to entry. Check out AdLib at getadlib.com today.
Welcome to Open Market, a podcast about building companies in the advertising industry. I'm Joe Zappa, and I'm joined by Eric Franchi, and someone even more central to the history of ad tech than Eric Franchi, Brian O'Kelly. What's up, guys?
Not much. So glad to be here.
Brian, good to have you. Thanks for doing this.
It's my great pleasure.
Yeah, Brian, we wanted to have you on to talk about culture, building companies, going after big problems. On the culture note, so I was listening to a pod you did with, I think, Paleo AdTech is the program, and you were telling the story of how I think when you were CEO and co-founder of LA Tonight, your co-founder sat you down, if I have this right, and they were like, Brian, you can't be mean to us. And then I was speaking to someone who worked for you at AppNexus, and he was talking about what, a brilliant, charismatic leader you were and how you had like a positive cult going on. So I'm curious for how you think about your evolution as a leader and your sort of disposition as a culture builder and how that's changed over the years.
Yeah, it's a great observation. I mean, when I was at LA Tonight, I just graduated from college, right? Computer scientist. And I guess for me, like the mission was all encompassing. I mean, I was living in like an ant infested, shared apartment in like the bad part of Koreatown, couldn't afford a car. All I did was work. So I think for me, it was like, we're going to run out of money if we don't do all the things. And we're competing with Ticketmaster to try to take tickets online. And this is it. Like we have $500,000 and like 6 weeks to launch, and let's effing do it. And so when my co-founders, who one was my best friend in the world and one was his best friend in the world, like when they're like, cool, we're going to go out to a club and hang out. And I was like, what the fuck? Like this is a startup, guys. Like it was a deep disconnect in terms of how we saw running a business. And for me, it was, very much a Silicon Valley, like we were going to be at the office until 2 a.m. writing code. And I think their perspective was different. And in hindsight, we were also a nightlife company. Like our job was to go out and get tickets. We were hiring writers from Variety and other amazing publications, Rolling Stone, to go be the nightlife source for LA and get tickets from venues. And arguably being in the zeitgeist and being sort of in the scene was part of the plan. But I just don't think we needed 2 of the 3 of us out partying with glow sticks to get tickets from these venues. And yeah, I was mean, but I wasn't just mean. I was like, you guys need to get some work done. It wasn't mean for the sake of like, I was mad. I was just like, this is not how we're going to make this company successful. And when they sat me down, they said, Brian, you have no EQ. Even if you're right, there's a way to say that that's productive and helpful and connecting, not just being a jerk. And I think that was actually an incredibly helpful lesson for me, is that really developing empathy, developing a way to talk to people, even when I'm right, even when I could see how important something was, finding a way to do that without destroying relationships, without being an asshole, without confusing my drive and ambition and way of doing things with other people's. I mean, that's all about developing as a leader. And I'd say the last 25 years for me of learning to lead as me, being, a computer scientist and a, workaholic and, sometimes a visionary. Not everybody thinks and operates the way I do. And by the way, if everyone was like me, it would be a really crappy company. you need all the kinds of people. You need all the kinds of motivation. You need to acknowledge good days and bad days. You need to acknowledge that some people like to have a drink and chill and talk through things quietly, and other people just want to get to business. I mean, all of that is about acknowledging how hard leadership is and how hard it is to work on yourself. I've been in therapy. I've had coaches. I've had tons of constructive feedback from my teams. I've been through a lot of just, you know, hard moments, like being on the couch with my co-founders of like, okay, like this is on me. It's on my shoulders to get better at being with people, working with people, giving feedback constructively, taking feedback constructively. I don't know, that progress and caring about it is the most important thing for all of us. And everything we do is, can we just get better at being ourselves as leaders over time, ideally without too many sore thumbs and, sore egos along the way?
What's the difference between the Brian of, maybe we'll just kind of jump to the ad tech Brian that everybody knows you from. So Brian as CTO of Right Media, Brian as CEO of AppNexus, and Brian as CEO of Scope 3. Like how have you and your leadership and your style, how has that evolved over the years?
I think there's a funny moment at Right Media where I show up at Yahoo to meet with this guy, Andy Atherton, and his assistant comes down. It's like, I'm sorry, Andy's busy. He can't meet you. And I'm like, okay, I'll wait. And I just sit in this conference room for like 3 hours. And finally, he sticks his head in. He's like, I already met with your CEO. I don't want to work with you guys. I'm like, okay, can we just talk about it? I'll come back tomorrow. And he's like, I'm working from home tomorrow. I'm like, cool. Where do you live? And I literally show up at his house and pitch him and this guy, Ryan Christensen. And they eventually are like, actually, let's do this. So that persistent, probably very annoying, I don't know, like just belief that what we're doing is important and what we could do to help a client succeed is worth being a little bit awkward and embarrassed. Like, I don't think that's changed at all. Like, I still love what I do. I still believe in what I do. I think there's value in people and relationships. And by the way, both Ryan and Andy ended up working for me at AppNexus and have gone on to do amazing things. Like, there's so many relationships that I've built over the years that I mean, some from back then. I mean, I think it's really cool that I'm still that person that would show up at Yahoo in shorts every day. I'm still wearing shorts to work. I think what's really different is just a recognition of how hard it is to deal with me. Like, I remember just feeling so frustrated at Right Media sometimes that people couldn't see what I thought was so obvious about things we were trying to do. I would just get so incredibly frustrated. Like, how do you not get this? It's so freaking obvious. But we all know, like, anyone who thinks ad tech is obvious is probably on something. And I guess to me, I didn't get the way that my brain happens to work and can see in those multiple dimensions around corners. I make intuitive leaps that I don't think other people do. And so figuring out how to be patient with people trying to understand what I'm saying or who don't get to that point, I think that's probably one of the biggest changes for me, is just finding people who can help me translate. Michael Rubenstein was a great example of this at AppNexus. Like, I would walk into his office every day and be like, Michael, I have the best idea, like literally the best idea. And he'd be like, wow, Brian, that's cool. Like, I can't wait to hear it. And I'd tell him, he'd write it down in his little moleskin. I'm like, what do you think? He'd be like, hey, I got to think about this some. That's a really, really good idea. I'll get back to you tomorrow.
That was a perfect Michael Rubenstein.
And I would be so frustrated. I'm like, what's wrong with this guy? Why can't he think on his feet? And then I'd come back the next day and he'd swing by my office and be like, hey, I've been thinking about that idea. I'm like, no, Michael, no, you were right. It's the worst idea ever. Don't even open your moleskin. You're so right. And he'd be like, oh, okay, wow, okay, whatever. And I'd say at least 80% of my ideas were just killed by Michael's moleskin. And even when they were good ideas, like having a thought partner to bounce them off of, having trusted people that I could just safely brainstorm with, meant that when I did actually have a good idea, I had a team of people who were helping me pull the organization along. We had a consultant named Dwight Porter, and 2 days a month we'd have strategy sessions, which were all about bringing the company along and surfacing ideas and just really explicitly splitting ideation from operation. For me, at least, it takes away the frustration that people can't. It's almost like creating a process to filter out good and bad ideas, creating a process for the organization to absorb those ideas. In scope 3, I'll give you an example where, I've had this thesis around AI that I've been kicking around. And I've been talking to my board about it and, doing some early work on it. And we had a board meeting yesterday and they said, so who's in the organization is working on AI with you? And I was like the people in this room. And they're like, well, that's interesting. Like, why aren't you doing it more broadly? I'm like, well, it's not ready. If we're going to do this, we're going to do this really thoughtfully. We're going to do this big. We're going to plan how we roll this stuff out because otherwise it's going to confuse everybody. And I think that's what I've learned is like, it's part of my job to protect the organization from me, but also to make sure it's not an organization that resists me. I think you see organizations like that a lot, where they are so resistant to innovation or ideation that they don't get anything done and they can't make decisions. It's a great Steve Jobs video where someone accuses him of not knowing what he's talking about, and making mistakes at Apple. And he's like, yeah, like we'll figure it out, but like at least we're not doing anything. I always like that bias to decide and make mistakes. And so I think that's the other balance of, Tom Shields said about AppNexus, it's a unique company that knows what it's doing is impossible and still thinks it can achieve it. A good quote. Can you believe it's impossible, know it's impossible, and do it anyway? Like that's about right.
How do you inspire larger groups of people and larger companies to action? Because you described what I think is the inevitable delta between the drive, energy, investment of the CEO and a lot of the other people in the organization. There will be some sickos, as I like to call them, some super type A people who are like totally down with it just as much as you are. But there are also going to be a lot of people in a large organization who do not have that disposition and are not don't have that bias for action. So how do you instill that in the rest of the organization?
I think one thing we did well at AppNexus is that our system of values was kind of defined to enable this. So we had 4 values: see and improve the whole system, which basically means improve is in our DNA, if that makes sense, in systematic ways. Learn and teach was a value, which I think is critical, right? It means we're always humble and learning, but we're also contributing that back. Because so much of what I'm doing is I'm learning ahead of the organization. And it also brings our customers in because we're learning from them and teaching them. Empower our customers, because we were a platform company. Like we only made money if our customers did. And so I think that was a really important one. And the last one was make greatness happen. Like our mission was built into that idea of, could we just do something even more big and awesome? And I used those 4 values in every communication I sent. Every time I stood in front of the company, I was weaving those values into everything. And then our mission was to create a better internet. And that was something that people rallied around. And we had examples of it. We were the first ad tech platform to ban Breitbart in 2016 when they were doing horrible things. And they came after us. They came after Josh Zeitz, who was our CMO, and made anti-Semitic comments about him on Breitbart, and we're like, fine, because right now, you're doing things that are really inciting violence and hate speech, and you are actually violating policies that are really important to us that we stand behind. And you see this whole GARM Elon Musk thing right now, and the conservatives really worried about the fairness and freeness of speech on the internet. And I feel like jumping into that is scary. Like anyone who willingly steps into the fray risks being called in front of Congress or attacked by Elon or whatever. And at the same time, if you truly believe as a company that your mission and vision requires you to make the internet better, like that's a rallying cry for people. And that does not mean bias against conservative media. In fact, it means bias toward open free media, but with some guide rails. And so I don't know, I think our willingness to be in that conversation, our willingness to take action, our willingness to make our values part of that communication every day and show examples means that for all those folks, like if you don't want to be at a company that's always trying to get better, I mean, you're not aligned with our values. Like you would actually get kicked out of the interview process if you didn't want to work at that kind of company. Look, if you don't want to work at a fully remote asynchronous company, don't apply to Scope 3 because we don't have offices. If you don't want to be at an organization that's deeply committed to learning together and sharing knowledge, please don't join Scope 3 because that's a value. If you're not curious, don't come here. And that's not to say I don't like you. I deeply appreciate that not everyone is that way, but we've decided to be a learning, curious organization. And to be part of this organization, you need to believe in our values. You need to believe in our mission. And I have to walk the walk. I have to represent that mission. My leadership team does. We all have to come to work as who we are. And that's, I think, why you meet AppNexus people and you're like, wow, this is a group of hopefully systems thinkers who are curious learners, who are always teaching and giving back, who care deeply about their customers and have this like little weird like need to do something great. Like it's who we were. And the cool thing is it's who we are. Like it was like you acted that way at AppNexus. It's the kind of people we hired. And that's the biggest thing people get wrong with values. They're hiring people and then enforcing the values. I feel like you hire the people that have those values. That's a big difference.
Let's continue on hiring because AppNexus has this like incredible legacy of just like awesome people that are in great leadership positions. So hiring based on alignment with values. And then what else do you use in your just like hiring practice, the way you recruit, the way you bring on people? Like what do you do that's different?
Well, one thing I've observed is that on my own, I have about a 50-50 track record for hiring, which I think is about normal, but I don't have any like magic secret sauce. One thing I did notice though was that when Michael and I took people to dinner or lunch, our track record went up to almost 100%. And there's one person we hired where Michael and I had lunch. And after lunch, I was like, nope. And Michael's like, Brian, I'm desperate. I'm hiring him anyway. And he didn't work out. So it's funny. It's the exception that proved the rule. Like, I think a lot of the reason is that if you spend a couple hours with somebody, you learn a lot about them. And also, like, to get to lunch with us, you had to go through a lot of interviews. But also, it meant that whoever's talking is not the one listening. And so Michael, probably getting out his moleskin, would see the dynamic and could see stuff, or that he'd ask a question and I could sort of observe. And there was something about that interaction that seemed like it was a really good way of predicting how people would respond to being in that environment. So that's a really interesting practice that I don't quite know why it works, but it works really well. I also think that, for me at least, trying to systematize a little bit how we interview is important. And at least for me, like I'll often get distracted in an interview. Everyone tells you their resume, and that's 20 minutes. And then you ask some sort of basic questions, and that's 20 minutes. And all of a sudden, you're 40 minutes into an interview and you haven't gotten to the right stuff. And so I started to just like almost write down ahead of time the 2 or 3 things I really wanted to get from the interview, to almost hold myself accountable for getting to the point. And that works pretty well. I'm also deeply afraid of groupthink in interview processes. Like something I've noticed is that, like, let's say I interview Joe and I love him. Like, I think he's freaking amazing. And I say, Eric, look, could you interview this guy, Joe? He's so awesome. Like, I really want to hire him. He's amazing. And then you interview him, you're like, oh my God, this guy's terrible. But maybe Brian saw something I didn't know about. And Brian's really smart and he's a legend. Man, I don't want to say something bad because I could hurt Brian's feelings, or maybe I look stupid. It's actually really hard to have an interview process, especially when you're desperate and you're trying to scale. And man, you really need somebody who can do that. Like the whole organization has a weird bias toward hiring. The hardest thing in an interview loop is being the one who's like, you know what? What about this? There's a woman who worked at AppNexus and now is at Scope 3, Lily Ratliff, who is an amazing interviewer. And she's fearless. She will say, almost always, 5 good things and 3 bad things about anyone she interviews, which is actually the reality. Like if you interviewed me and you couldn't find 3 bad things, like you didn't interview me. I can tell you at least 20. And I actually think that's a really healthy question is, if you're 2 thumbs up on a candidate, you still better have 1 thumb down somewhere. I think that's critical for us is why might this candidate not work? What are the things that are risks? I feel like if a candidate doesn't have at least one really sparkly thing where you're like, wow, that blew my mind, you shouldn't hire them. And if you can't find anything wrong with a candidate, you didn't interview very well. And if you have a culture where you can't talk about those things, something's wrong with your culture and your hiring culture. I can go through so many people where we didn't do what I just said and we hired the wrong person or we put someone in the wrong role. I just have this whole list of like scars, you know, why you shouldn't hire someone to the job past they're ready for. I've done that so many times and I always regret it. It's things like that I just feel like after 20 something years of managing, I mean, I've been an executive since I graduated college. I mean, LA Tonight, when I got called to the couch, I was 21 years old, the CEO of a 30-person company. Okay. Like I've only done this. I've never not done this. And I'm still bad at it. So most of this is just painful lessons.
We all have to narrativize periods of our life, ventures, and so on. And so when you think about AppNexus now, several years removed, how do you narrativize the success? Like if you had to identify a few factors, why do you think AppNexus had what I think most would regard as a pretty favorable exit? Certainly one of the best exits in ad tech, where so many of its competitors ultimately sort of failed or petered out.
It's hard for me not to talk about the founding story of being hurt and angry from being fired from Right Media and feeling like I had something to prove. I think what motivated me, especially through 2008, which was a really bad year with the financial crash and through some really challenging times, was just this deep need to prove myself. And so the first few years were really, coming from my own pain and need to prove myself. And I think then there was like a second phase where like all of a sudden we're this really successful market leader. And I had to figure out like, what do you do when you've already succeeded? Like our initial vision was be a billion-dollar company. That's not a very good vision, by the way, because what if you do it and there's no guide rails? What kind of billion-dollar company? And I think the second phase was how to build a great company that's also a good company. And that's where those values I mentioned and the mission, a lot of my own personal development and growth were about if you could build a wonderful company, what would it be? And so that's a little bit of the Brian narrative of it. But in some ways, that reflects the company narrative of, in the beginning, it was hire a bunch of really smart, amazing people and throw them at the problem. And the second half was like build an amazing organization, more like a garden where people could flourish. And my job became more about weeding the garden of the problems and creating a space for the organization to grow. But it was less and less the Brian story. And it was more and more the AppNexus story. And the thing I'm proudest of is that I was able to leave that company in 2018 and it kept on cranking. And that all those amazing people kept doing their thing. And look, AT&T could have done more with it probably. But the fact that, 2024, and it still powers ads on Netflix and, that it's still a multi-$100 million ad tech business. And some of the best people I've ever worked with came through that company. I mean, it's funny. I'm so much more proud of the people than I am about the outcome. And I'm so much more proud of selling it to make everybody money than I am about selling it because it was a big exit. Like it was the most painful thing to sell that company. But so many people have told me that they put their kid through college or they put a down payment on their house or they went out to become a COO or a CEO or founded something or got to like just incredibly proud of that second half of that company, even though I don't think the valuation went up very much. Like I don't think we created a lot of enterprise value for our investors in that second half, but man, we made the world better. Like it was so much not me and was so much about them that I think it's really special.
We had a note to ask you if you could do the deal differently at the end, would you? Based on what you just said, sounds like probably not.
Well, I would have just sold it to Microsoft in the first place, because AT&T was our stalking horse. I thought we would just get an offer from AT&T and take it to Microsoft. And so the whole time was convinced Microsoft was what was going to happen. I never really thought we'd sell it to AT&T, especially because we'd asked them for 2 billion and they didn't hit the number we asked for. And so it's kind of like, okay, like this is not what we're worth, but okay, like good start. Hey, Microsoft. And it's so ironic that Microsoft went back and bought it, but I wanted to work at Microsoft. I have so much respect for Satya and for Brad Smith. I kind of felt like we could be perfect inside the Microsoft org. I don't know. I just never really thought we were going to close with AT&T, partially because I also knew that I wouldn't stay at AT&T because, I knew Brian Lesser wanted to be the CEO and like, you don't need two CEOs. And in hindsight, I'm glad we sold. It was the right thing for the team. The team made, over $100 million of incentives after the deal. I didn't get a retention package, but the team got tons of money. That's why many of them are still there. The fact that selling put so much money into people's pockets afterward, yeah, I wouldn't change that, but I would skip the AT&T part and just do it straight with Microsoft. I might be working at Microsoft if that had been the case. So I'm not sure if that's good or bad.
I want to go back to the question about the question of drive and when you find employees, how you optimize for that. Because I think when you just described the story of AppNexus, I would say the beginning you're describing, force of will, your vision and the people it probably attracted around you. And in the beginning, that's a huge factor. The founder, they individually have such an impact on the fate of the company, and they also attract people around them. I think the bigger you get, the more difficult that becomes. So you talked about values, and no doubt that's part of how you systemize it. But I'm curious, like with where ad tech is now as an industry, which is quite different, and I think a lot of people would say like a bit less exciting than it was 10 or 15 years ago. Like, how do you still attract that caliber of employee at scale?
Do you think that Joe's statement is accurate, that it's less exciting than it was 10, 15 years ago?
I kind of feel like ad tech is the most exciting it's been in a long time right now.
Thank you.
I see so much innovation happening. And it's like the world is changing beneath us. Like the problem was the world was kind of boring for a while, And I'm all for retail media networks, but like the idea of, a data-driven ad network is not particularly novel. It's just novel that these particular data owners figured it out. I think what we're seeing with AI, what we're seeing with antitrust trials and potentially shakeups of value chains, I think we're in a moment where the internet's going to look dramatically different for our kids than it did for us, of course. And we have no idea what that's going to look like. Like we are, to me, very blind to what the world looks like in 5 years. And that means innovation is going to be incredibly important and rewarded. And the structures, the technical and business structures from 5 years ago aren't going to work. So this is the moment to innovate. And I think my pitch to a lot of people who come to Scope 3 is one, we're a family first company. Like on my leadership team, we've got 3 4-year-olds, like there's not a single day where one of us doesn't have a childcare problem. I don't think. And the whole company is built around this idea. And one reason we're remote and asynchronous is so that we can live our lives and participate in a startup, regardless of where we are in the world. That's really important to me for a work-life balance perspective. We pay really well and we're well funded. And we have this incredible drive and passion, but kind of like marathon runner drive and passion, not sprint and kill ourselves drive and passion. We also have this big purpose. Like our purpose is, to reimagine the internet through the lens of sustainability and do that in a way that drives incredible efficiencies for all the stakeholders. And for anyone who's been in this industry, who's seen the opportunity to make it better, we're actually driving systemic change. And I think that's cool. And people want to be part of that. Of course, there's some Brian O'Kelly mystique. There's also some, anti-mystique. But I don't know. I think people see us as a purpose-driven, ethical company driving change, and I also think we've been really good for people's careers. I mean, look at AppNexus and where people have gone. We invest in talent. We invest in people. We care about people. And I think that shows up in the kind of people we bring on board. So if you want to work at a startup but don't want to work crazy ass startup hours, if you want to work at a startup but get paid fairly and well for doing a lot of hard work, not that many places you can go. and save the world.
I think the last bit on saving the world is the big variable between Scope 3 and a lot of other ad tech companies. And of course, you're also going to catch a lot of heat for that. Like, I guarantee you a lot of people listening to this are like, rolling their eyes when we say change the world, right? But the provisional headline for the episode was building a culture and tackling big problems. And the latter is essential to the former, right? Like, if you want to attract people who are super driven and who want to say something bold and do something provocative, then you have to have a big problem. It can't be just like, well, we're going to create like the 17th, DSP, and we're going to try to skim some money off this part of the industry that is basically fully baked.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I also think I sort of say save the world with a little bit of self-deprecation because, save the internet was a big enough mission at AppNexus. The idea of save the world and the internet, like it's like out of a Silicon Valley TV show or something. I do think, though, that if you can point to things you do that are actually positive, that make a real impact in your job, because a lot of people are like, I'm going to make a bunch of money selling drugs and I'm going to give it to Harvard. Like, okay, I don't want to make a bunch of money doing the right thing the whole way along. It's a really high bar. I do get a lot of eye rolls. A lot of people are very skeptical of it, and we have to deliver. And I actually feel like it's better to say, this is our purpose and we're going to hold ourselves to it, even though people will roll their eyes, because it forces us to be accountable. It's like if I tell you I'm going to lose 10 pounds and the next time you see me, I look the same, I'm going to be embarrassed that I didn't do what I said. So I'm saying it here. I'll say it again and again. We are actually going to, make a positive environmental impact on this industry and the world. And we're going to hold ourselves accountable to it. It's my personal reputation, which I've spent 20 years building, that this is legitimately going to make the world better. And also, I've made a lot of money. I don't care about money. I care about that mission way more than a financial outcome. I only care about a financial outcome because I want my team to have a great outcome. I want my investors to have an outcome. I want to get more money from investors so I can do more things. But what motivates me matters because I'm the CEO of the company and I want to do this. I'm going to do this. And I think that is really important. Like I have to walk the walk, but I mean, that's bullshit. Everyone can say I walk the walk. Do you take a private jet to work? You're done. If you say anything about sustainability, you're done. I'm a vegetarian. Why? It's not that I don't like eating meat. It's that I can't look myself in the mirror and say, I work for a climate company and I'm going to go around eating a bunch of beef. It doesn't make me feel good. I'm not saying you have to do that. And I'm not going to force you to do that. But if we all look in the mirror and hold ourselves accountable, people will believe what we say. I don't know. It's hard because we are such a cynical culture. Everyone is looking for cancellation reasons and bullshit. And I'm sure, yes, people have been rolling their eyes this whole episode. I think the second you said Brian O'Kelly, I'm thinking probably half the people rolled their eyes, but whatever. I'm going to do it anyway. I don't care what you think.
Let's stay on scope 3 for a few. Joe, you collected what were 3, probably sort of kind of common market objections that you've heard around just the idea of focusing on sustainability. Why don't you hit Brian with one by one? See what he has to say.
All right, Brian, objection number 1. The problem isn't significant or urgent, meaning sustainability in digital advertising, specifically, obviously not the broader problem of climate change.
I mean, first of all, do we believe that climate change is a significant and urgent problem? I'm going to just presume we agree this is a significant, urgent problem. The fastest growing use of energy in the US for any industry is data centers. And, if you look at Georgia, Virginia, other states where we're seeing huge numbers of data centers being constructed, large percentages of the electricity and water in those states are being used not just to build data centers, but also to turn back on or not shut down natural gas and coal plants. And I can go through the world, but there's jurisdictions like West London where you can't build houses because there's not enough grid power because of all the data centers. So data centers are contributing not just to climate change, but they're also contributing to significant impact to people in their lives. And if you add it up, I think it was Morgan Stanley came out and said 70 million metric tons of carbon worth of new data centers will be built in the US by 2027. That's massive. New York is like 90 million. if you look at a city. Global air travel is 800 million. So we're talking, that's new. That's not the existing, that's new. So we're talking about like data centers are legitimately a meaningful part of the global climate crisis. Now, look, I'm not saying we shouldn't also solve concrete and steel and transportation and everything else. But if you are in this industry and you look at that and say, wow, I'm part of that, we think that if we were to fully decarbonize ad tech, it's about 7 million metric tons. So, okay, that's 10% of AI, but that's pretty big. And by the way, guess what AI is doing? Perplexity is adding ads. How are they going to fund this stuff? It's going to be ads. AI is directly in line with advertising. Meta, 600,000 GPUs that they're building. What is Meta's business model? Ads. Like, we can't distinguish ads and AI. We can't look away and say that all these data centers and all this use of AI is not directly in our line of sight. And so all of this comes back to this basic point, which is no, it will not single-handedly solve climate change. No, it's not enough to say we're also not going to fly private planes and we're not going to eat meat. And there's so much we have to do. But if you look at the million people in this industry and say, look, what we can do as an industry is meaningful, it's going to make an impact, and we don't need to put in new gas pipelines or retool steel plants or find new sources of fake meat. Like, we can just do this. Like, just the idea that SPO would save 1 million metric tons of carbon, and SPO would save marketers a bunch of money and would save actually everyone in the ecosystem money. Like, that just seems like we can probably do that, and no one's going to look back a year from now and be like, man, I miss all those duplicate auctions. So these are the things I think a lot about. Is if this were asking people to fundamentally change anything about their lives, it would be hard. But this is an inefficiency that we can solve that will meaningfully move the needle in this space, and is a big step that happens now, not in 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years.
Speaking of inefficiencies, an argument that Scope 3 makes that I think is compelling is that eliminating carbon waste doesn't just eliminate carbon waste, it eliminates financial waste for advertisers and other parties in the ecosystem. However, this raises the objection. If you can eliminate a lot of carbon waste by eliminating those other sources of waste, like MFAs or non-viewable ads or bid duplication, why do you need a company to target carbon specifically? Like, might agencies say, well, we're just working on efficiency generally, and we'll just kill carbon emissions as a byproduct of that?
In 2016, I wrote a blog post about supply path optimization, and it was so controversial at AppNexus, they wouldn't let me publish it on the AppNexus website. I had to start my own blog to publish it because it was so scandalous. So that's where Bach on Ads came from, was I couldn't convince my management team to let me post this blog. And it was like, this is going to destroy all these inefficiencies. And, everyone freaked out. And so then I sold AppNexus, retired from advertising, stopped reading any industry publications, like basically deleted the word ads from my life. And 3 years later, in 2021, I got this idea for Scope 3. And I was like, I wonder what's going on in this industry. How surprised do you think I was that the first thing I saw was like everyone talking about SPO? And I'm like, didn't we solve this? Like, wasn't this a pretty obvious solution? And it was like multiple marketers saying in like their New Year's resolution for 2022 was like, we're doing SPO this year. Well, guess what? It's 2024. Pretty sure we still have bid duplication. We have MFA. We have non-viewable ads. And so I think we've given like the supposed financial motivation its chance. And we think of ourselves as a capitalist society. We think that we are always doing the most efficient thing. This is interesting. I talked to someone from Amazon, and they said that AWS did an experiment. They called a bunch of their clients and said, hey, you guys have a bunch of idle servers. You're wasting like 50 grand a month. You should turn them off. And these developers were like, yeah, we'll get to it. Nothing happened. Then they called back and said, you know what? You're wasting like 50 tons of carbon a month. They turned them off immediately. It's the same thing. But what's interesting is it's somebody else's money. Those developers, it's not their money. They don't really care. But you know what? It's our planet. And so while, yes, it's the same action, people are not motivated rationally. And this goes back to, me sitting on the couch with my best friends in LA tonight and being like, why are you guys not working harder? Obviously we're founding this company. What's wrong with you? You know what? They just don't motivate and think the same way. Carbon is a really useful way to talk about the real world impact, to remind us that the cloud isn't some fluffy thing in the sky. It's an actual data center. And that the choices we make where we click in a DSP or how we actually do our commercial deals have a real world impact. It's not just an ephemeral internet. It's an actual choice that matters. And I think that's funny because, we're talking about ad tech being stagnant. Part of the reason it's stagnant is because I think we forget how real this is. This is about the fate of businesses. This is about the fate of consumer privacy. How we show up on the internet has deep implications for people's lives. And we make it too easy to sort of abstract ourselves from the pain or the opportunity or anything else. And I think making it more real is important. What we do matters. If you're listening to this and you work in ad tech, not just because of climate, because the entire global economy depends on advertising and media. Free media is important so people have an open understanding of what's happening in the world. We need to fund journalism. We need to fund games. We need to do everything we can to make the internet thrive. And it's too important to send a bunch of money down a bunch of duplicate bid paths that doesn't put our money and our carbon in places that are the best for our clients and for the world.
One of the objections I hear, and this is the last one, is, and this surprised me, I hadn't necessarily anticipated this when I started talking about sustainability on Twitter, for example, is people say it's going to be another hoop for publishers to jump through, and hasn't ad tech done enough to publishers without giving them, another metric they need to optimize for in order to earn advertiser dollars. So I'm curious how you talk to publishers about that.
It's really funny because that reflects a mistake we made 2 years ago where we didn't exactly know. Like, my hypothesis was that this was going to be great for publishers. And does it sound familiar? I thought they would see it. I thought they would get it. And so I didn't really pitch it like, hey, A, B, C, D, here's how this helps you. I was just like, hey, check it out. Let's go do this. And they're like, but this is another, brand safety. I'm like, how is it like brand safety? That's totally not this. Well, now you're going to make me redo my pages. And I'm like, well, maybe, but like, you're already good. Like, you're the Guardian. You don't have to, you're the greenest publisher out there. Like, this is just good for you. This makes you look good. They were so skeptical because I just figured they'd get it. And then we had to learn how to walk publishers through the point, which is that much of what ad tech's doing with all this duplication and all this intermediation is commoditizing publishers, and it's taking them away from those connections with brands where they create the most value. And we talk about sustainability, we're actually talking about reconnecting publishers and brands. We're talking about helping publishers decommodify, to help them tell their story. Because you know what? If I was with Cartier as an example, as a brand, it can. And they're like, we don't really buy programmatic. What should we do to get media efficiency? I'm like, well, you guys work with the New York Times. You don't buy programmatically in the New York Times. You buy their kick-ass native units that are really low carbon because there's no auction. They're full bleed. They're interactive. I mean, these are amazing, high-quality units that tell your story incredibly well to your target audience with almost no carbon. You're doing it. And they were like shocked. They're like, really? We're already green? And I was like, yeah. Like, and that's great for the Times, right? The Times should be out there. Joy should be out telling that story to other brands, being like, hey, check out Cartier. They've got a corporate media, carbon target. They're hitting it because they're buying our best units direct with no carbon or almost no carbon. And that's the kind of story I wish I'd known how to tell the publishers in the first place, because every publisher I talk to really just wants to be able to sell their first-party data, their unique native ad units, to work directly with brands to talk about attention and efficiency and, viewability. Everything they're already doing, we amplify. But that objection, and the reason it surprises you is because it surprised me too. I thought, obviously, this is good for publishers, but anytime you hear me say the word obviously, like, I should have like a thing on my computer that just says, Brian, it's not obvious. So I think we figured that out. And I do think we've actually signed an amazing group of publishers, including, as an example, Snap, which doesn't work programmatically, is super green and efficient and has an amazing opportunity for brands because they have short, high impact, like mobile native creatives that are actually very low bandwidth. They have things like sponsored lenses. Like what they're doing to tell stories for brands are amazing. And they don't need huge, complex programmatic auctions to do it. It's one of those startup things, right? Like now we have to re-educate some folks. But at the same time, I think that's the journey for all of us as marketers and as leaders is acknowledging, look, we kind of made a mistake and now we're learning and now we're, evolving. And I think it's actually resonating really well with both brands and publishers because brands don't want to be commoditized either. They want to find ways to tell their story uniquely and powerfully to the right audience. It all fits.
A few months ago, you said something that was like simple, but it just keeps knocking around my head that we're at the beginning of the next epoch in advertising. What did you mean by that? And like, what are some examples of the things that you're kind of seeing around the corner or thinking about, or are those like, I think, kind of big projects that folks should be tackling?
When I started AppNexus, the iPhone hadn't come out yet. Facebook and Twitter didn't exist yet. I mean, imagine starting a company before smartphones and before mobile. Do you think that company would be relevant in 15 years? Like the idea that we're still doing exactly the same business model that was built before CTV, before, I kind of feel like we're so overdue for a new paradigm, partially because the old paradigm worked so well. And the reason it worked so well was because pre-exchange, you couldn't buy the internet. And the reality is you can't really buy the internet programmatically right now, but we have a lot of pipes and hooks and, pieces. I really respect companies like LiveRamp and caveat, I'm on the board, but like the idea that you can put your data in one place and push it into all of these different platforms and collaborate to create value with hundreds of different media companies and marketing platforms around the world. Like that's an equally exciting vision that I think we still haven't plumbed the depths of. But I think that epoch is the idea of auctioning every ad doesn't really make sense. And I think the idea of the web as the primary surface of the internet doesn't make sense. But what's next? And this is where AI is interesting. The pull versus the push, that we get today. I pull information to my computer. I'm like, I'm going to go to this site and get it versus it being pushed to me. That's a different paradigm. And I don't know what that means for advertising because so much of advertising is waiting for that pull. Like when you load the page, we show an ad. But what if it's the opposite? I mean, I'm so tied to this idea of ad serving that I don't know what that means. And I don't think anybody does. But Eric, what I love about what you're doing at Aperium is you're investing in companies that are around the corner. And I don't think maybe you do, like exactly which of those innovators has the right idea. But because you're looking at that next horizon, you're seeing so many of these possible futures that maybe one of those will be right. And because of your incredible influence and Joe's vision and what you guys do, maybe you make one of those happen. And that's what's exciting to me is it's going to happen. Something new is coming that we don't know yet. And we will look back at this as an epochal moment. So we can save this podcast and you can say, wow, we were so smart. We called it. The thing is, don't tell future us that we have no idea what it is. Like I didn't know it was going to be the iPhone and social media in 2007, but we're going to look really smart because we'll just edit this and say, we knew the next epoch would be, and then we'll just fill that in.
That's amazing. All right. This was epic. Thank you, Brian. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you. Joe, you want to take us home?
Yeah, Brian, thanks so much for being here, guys. Subscribe, like, find us on social, yell at us in the digital public square. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, guys. Super fun.
Amazing.
All right,
we'll do it again.
Awesome.